You are kneeling on woven tatami that bites into your knees. Smoke crawls under the paper screens like a living thing, stinging your eyes, turning every breath into ash. Somewhere beyond the painted doors, men are screaming, not the clean shout of battle, but the animal sound of bodies breaking. You don't stand. You don't run. Your hands move with a calm that frightens you more than the noise outside, reaching for a length of silk cord, as if it were a prayer. In the lamplight, the cord glows pale and innocent. You loop it around your legs, just above the knees, and pull. The fibers tighten. Skin compresses. Bone answers with dull pressure. Another pull, harder, until your thighs tremble. Not from weakness, but from the terrible clarity of what comes next. When the door finally slides open, when the footsteps come, when the world ends, you will not be found sprawled. You will not be found ruined. If this is your last moment, it will be arranged. The act has a name history, tends to whisper rather than pronounce. Jigai. It is often described as female seppuku, but that neat translation hides the hardest part, the part that is not about blood, but about control. Jigai was a ritualized suicide associated with samurai women, especially in moments when defeat, capture, or dishonor threatened to swallow a household whole. In the same society that demanded men prove loyalty with a blade across the belly, women were expected to preserve dignity by different rules, with different weapons and a different terror. The method often centered on cutting the throat or severing the carotid, fast, decisive, and horrifyingly intimate. And then there is the detail that makes modern audiences flinch, the binding of the legs. Why bind your knees before death? Why, in the last seconds of life, spend precious breath making sure your body will fall in a certain way? It sounds like a footnote, like a strange cultural flourish. But within the world of the samurai household, posture was not decoration. It was identity. It was reputation. It was the final proof that even the worst moment could not steal discipline. And once you understand that, the ritual stops being exotic and becomes something colder, a system that could turn a home into a stage and a woman into the final symbol of a family's honor. Before we go deeper, tell me where you're watching from. Honestly, it never stops amazing me that stories like this travel farther than any army ever could. To understand Jigai, you have to walk into the architecture of samurai life, the kind built not only from wood and paper, but from expectations so heavy they might as well be stone. In a warrior household, a wife was not merely a companion. She was the keeper of lineage, the manager of the inner world, the person who would still be standing when the men rode out and did not come back. She learned formal etiquette the way soldiers learned formations. She learned how to receive guests, how to carry herself, how to speak in a way that never cracked the surface of composure. Because composure was the point. Your face could not betray panic. Your posture could not betray fear. If you were taken, if you were paraded, if you were violated, the shame would not stop at your skin. It would spread backward through generations and forward into the future. And that is where Jigai lived, in the seam between personal terror and communal expectation. It is easy to imagine the samurai wife as silent and submissive, but the reality is more complicated and more brutal. Many women in warrior families were trained in self-defense. Some practiced with the kaiken, a small dagger often associated with women of the samurai class. They were not expected to fight on a battlefield like men, but they were expected to defend the household, to resist capture, and, when resistance could no longer change the outcome, to decide how the story ended. Picture a castle at night, not the romantic kind with lanterns and poetry, but the kind that smells like damp timber and old iron. The corridors are narrow. The screens are thin. You can hear everything. In a siege, sound becomes prophecy. The distant crack of arquebus fire, the heavy thud of bodies dragged across boards, the shouting that gets closer, then stops, then starts again. A household doesn't need a messenger to know when the gates have fallen. The air itself changes. It tastes of inevitability. Inside the women's quarters, Someone is whispering instructions like they are folding clothes. Gather the children. Hide the family documents. Burn what must not be taken. And then, in a corner where the lamplight doesn't quite reach, the silk cord appears. The cord is not an afterthought. It is part of the ritual's logic. It is preparation for the body's betrayal, because the body does not die politely. When a throat is cut, the body can convulse, the legs can kick, the hips can open. Death can turn a disciplined posture into something uncontrolled, something animal. And within a culture where the smallest breach of modesty could be weaponized against a family name, that uncontrolled sprawl was not seen as natural. It was seen as a final humiliation. The binding of the legs, knees drawn together, tied tight, was a way to impose order on the moment when order is usually impossible. The knot is a statement. Even now, even like this, I will not be displayed. But Jigai was not only about avoiding shame. It was also about sending a message. If a samurai man died with seppuku, it could be interpreted as loyalty, protest, or defiance, depending on who survived to tell it. A woman's Jigai could say, "You may take the castle, but you will not take us. You may burn the banners, but you will not write your victory on my body." It was an ending designed to deny an enemy a certain kind of triumph. And yet, it was also a tragedy designed by the living, because the ritual did not emerge from nowhere. It grew out of a society that treated women's bodies as extensions of household honor, not wholly their own. The choice, when it existed, was made inside a corridor of pressures: fear of capture, fear of assault, fear of disgrace, fear of what would happen to children if the women were taken alive. Jigai could be an act of agency in a world with limited agency, and at the same time, it could be a coerced script, handed down like etiquette, rehearsed until it felt inevitable. If you want to see how this becomes real, don't start with a famous battlefield. Start with the smaller, more intimate horror, the moment the women realize the men will not come back. Imagine a samurai wife. Let's call her Tomo. Not because she is the legendary warrior, but because the name feels like the kind a poet would give to someone who deserved better. Tomo is not a peasant pulled into history by accident. She is part of the warrior class. She has been taught to write with controlled elegance and to bow with precise angles. She knows which lacquered box holds the family seals. She knows the routes through the castle that servants aren't supposed to know. And she knows, somewhere in the back of her mind, that Jigai is not a myth. It is a contingency plan. On the day the castle falls, nothing feels like the stories. There is no heroic soundtrack. There is only confusion, smoke, running feet, a servant sobbing so hard she can't speak, the smell of something burning that should not be burning, cedar beams, silk robes, rice stores, perhaps the library. Tomo is told the Lord is dead or missing. The message is unclear. The uncertainty is worse than truth, because it leaves hope alive long enough to make the next step feel like murder. In the women's chamber, someone older, an aunt, a retainer's widow, a woman who has seen what defeat looks like, begins to distribute the implements: a knife wrapped in cloth, a cord, maybe a small wooden tray, because even death must have proper presentation. The younger women stare as if it's a ceremony from another world. The older woman does not raise her voice. She doesn't have to. The castle is already shouting for her. Tomoe looks toward the children. Maybe her own child is there. Maybe she is holding the hand of a niece, a boy too young to understand, a girl old enough to understand too much. And this is where the story splits into its cruelest question. Who is Jigai for? The woman about to die, or the household that must be remembered as pure even in defeat? The silk cord is brought forward. It is soft, but it bites when pulled tight. Tomo kneels, because kneeling is how women are supposed to receive important things: tea, guests, news, fate. She threads the cord around her knees. The act is strangely domestic, like tying up a bundle, like securing cloth before travel. But there is no travel after this, only the stillness. The knot matters. Too loose, and the legs can splay anyway. Too tight and it cuts circulation, causes pain that makes the hands shake. The hands must not shake. That is the rule. So she pulls it just enough, then a second time, then tucks the end the way she was taught to tuck sleeves, neatly so nothing flutters. Even now. Somewhere in the distance a door breaks. Here the ritual reveals its second, darker layer, the choreography of speed. Jigai, as described in later accounts and cultural memory, emphasizes a quicker death than male seppuku. Male seppuku is often portrayed as drawn out, involving an abdominal cut, and sometimes a second person to decapitate and end suffering. Female ritual suicide, in many descriptions, focuses on cutting the throat or severing a major artery, because it must be decisive. There is no room for hesitation. There is no theatrical time. The enemy is already inside the walls. Tomoe lifts the blade. And the blade is not a katana. It is smaller, intimate, almost insulting in its size compared to the swords that define the samurai myth. A woman's dagger is meant to be hidden in a sleeve, tucked in a sash, kept close like a secret. The irony is unbearable. The tool of final honor is something you could conceal beneath fabric. Her breathing becomes loud in her own ears. The mind tries to run ahead and refuses. It keeps returning to details, the coldness of steel, the pressure of the cord, the way ash floats like snow. She thinks of her husband, not in romance, but in obligation. She thinks of the household crest, the mon, stamped on lacquer and paper. She thinks of how an enemy might laugh if they found her body ruined, legs open, robe shifted. She thinks of strangers making stories out of her shame. And then the decision sharpens, not because she wants death, but because she refuses a particular kind of living. This is the first spike of horror. Jigai is not only death, it is avoidance. It is a woman choosing a blade over what the world might do to her if she stays alive. Modern viewers often frame that as honor, and sometimes it was described that way. But the emotional core is closer to terror and control. She is not chasing glory. She is fencing off the future. Tomoe presses the dagger to her throat. The skin is warm. The steel is cold. The contrast is so intense, it feels like a betrayal. Outside, voices shout. A man laughs. Maybe an invader, maybe a desperate defender slipping into madness. The sound hits her like a slap. The body wants to flinch. The cord prevents her legs from moving, and the restriction, meant for dignity, suddenly feels like a trap. The ritual demands she remain composed. The siege demands she hurry. Her heart is trying to escape her ribs. Then she pulls. There is no poetic way to describe it. The throat opens. Breath becomes a wet gasp. Pain flares so bright it's almost white. And then the world starts to tilt. Blood is not symbolic. It is heavy, warm, unstoppable. Her hands lose strength. The dagger slips. The cord holds her knees together as her torso sways, and the body convulses anyway. This is the detail that makes the leg binding make sense in the most brutal way. Death spasms don't care about ideals. Muscles fire. The spine arches. The jaw clenches. The body tries reflexively to keep living. But the knot holds. The knees remain together. The posture remains, if not graceful, at least controlled. The ritual wins its final argument. Tomoe collapses forward, not sprawled, not open, but folded into herself like a closing screen. If you were to step into that room after, you might see a tableau that looks almost peaceful in stillness. Kneeling figures, hair arranged, robes in order, the cord binding what life could not bind. And in the center of that calm is a violence so intimate it would haunt the air. But the story doesn't stop at one woman. That's the second spike. Jigai is often remembered as an individual act, yet it was sometimes communal. In certain desperate situations, groups of women and children died together, not because death was holy, but because the alternative was considered worse. The castle, in those moments, became less a fortress and more a sealed room. The ritual became not only personal dignity, but collective erasure, an attempt to deny the victors hostages, spoils, and bargaining chips. And that turns the romance of samurai honor into something closer to a nightmare of social accounting. There were rules for everything, even for this. Accounts and later cultural depictions emphasize that a woman's jigai should be performed with clean composure. The clothing should be arranged properly. The hair should not be wild. The body should not be indecent. The leg binding is part of that, because the worst insult was not death, but exposure. Exposure to enemy eyes, to gossip, to the kind of story that would survive longer than the woman herself. Some households even prepared in advance. That's the third spike. The ritual wasn't always improvised in crisis. In some warrior families, a dagger and cord were part of a woman's expected possessions, like a grim heirloom. It is chilling to imagine a young bride receiving household items, textiles, lacquerware, writing brushes, and alongside them, the means to end her life properly. Not as a threat, but as training. A quiet reminder. Your dignity is your duty. If that sounds like cruelty disguised as virtue, that's because it often was. And yet, the emotional truth is complicated. Because within that system, some women did find something like strength in preparedness. Knowing the ritual meant knowing the terms of the world you lived in. It meant not being helpless. The dagger was not just for suicide. It could also be for defense. The cord in some contexts was not only for death. It could be for restraint, escape, practical use. The same object could be ordinary or fatal depending on the day. That ambiguity is what makes the ritual feel so haunting. It turns domestic items into weapons against one's own future. Now widen the lens. Jigai exists within the larger mythology of the samurai, and like all mythologies, it has layers. Some historical, some romanticized, some weaponized by later generations. In later eras, especially when warrior ideals were being codified into moral instruction, stories of women dying beautifully could be used as propaganda. The ritual could be portrayed not as desperation, but as purity. Not as fear, but as devotion. It could become a lesson taught to girls. Be loyal, be composed, be willing to disappear rather than embarrass your family. That's when the leg binding becomes more than a practical detail. It becomes an emblem, a symbol of how deeply the expectation of modesty could reach, down to the shape of a corpse. In certain narratives, the woman is praised for not disgracing herself. But what does that phrase really mean? It means the world was willing to treat her body as a billboard for victory. It means her survival could be turned into entertainment. It means her suffering could be used as currency. Jigai, then, is not only a ritual of honor, it is a portrait of the threat of dishonor. And the binding is the clearest clue that the fear was not only death. The fear was being seen. Because in that moment, being seen could be a form of violence all by itself. Leg binding was never just practical. It meant imagining the gaze of others, even at the edge of death. The enemy's eyes, servants' whispers, the chronicler's brush, the judgment of generations not yet born. The final act was not only for the self, but for an audience that would never speak back. That invisible audience is the real pressure, the unseen hand tightening the knot. Tomoe's story, whether one woman or many folded into a single name, does not end with the blade. The invaders still enter. The castle still falls. They walk through rooms where death has been arranged with ceremonial precision. Some recoil, some sneer, some bow with reluctant respect. And some record what they see, turning the scene into a story that outlives the smoke. That is how Jigai survives, not through the women who performed it, but through those who found them and decided what it meant. Over time, the ritual is simplified. They bound their legs for modesty. True, but incomplete. They bound them because shame was treated as worse than death, because dignity was demanded even from a convulsing body, because the gaze of the living reached into the silence of the dead. The legacy of Jigai is not honor alone. It is the reminder that culture can make survival unbearable and call certain deaths beautiful. A silk cord, a small blade, and the quiet insistence that even death must obey the rules of the living.